ESG has been a standard discussion item in boardrooms across the world, as a variety of key stakeholders have elevated their interest in this space. Whether it comes to investors, regulators, analysts, rating agencies, even prospective employees, the trajectory of the focus on ESG is going nowhere but north. Good morning. My name is Adam Goldstein, the Chief Business Officer at the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, and we welcome you to this morning's session on ESG. It's a pleasure to be here with my panelists, and we want to thank the NJBankers for organizing this event and inviting us to speak at it. Our plan today is to go through all aspects of ESG. We'll cover them individually with an introduction. We'll leg into E, then S, then G, and then talk a little bit about our predictions for the future of ESG. We intend to go about 45-50 minutes. We are pre-recording this session on February 10th. When you see it, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We'll be listening in with you. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the question box or just contact us individually, and we'll be happy to answer questions offline after the conference. All of our bios are on the NJBankers platform, so you can read up about us. We don't want to waste too much time going through all of our bios, and that would be taking up a lot of time, since the folks on the panel really are titans in their industry. They're centers of influence regarding ESG, which is why they were hand-selected to participate in this panel. We have Larry Bard, co-chair of securities at Shulman Rogers, Megan Fox, vice president, senior analyst at Moody's Investor Service, and Ricardo Martinez, principal of sustainable financial risk and a leader in that space at Deloitte. Welcome everybody to today's panel. I appreciate you being with me and with the NJBankers and the folks that are listening in. I'd like to start a little bit with just kind of getting our feet wet, which is something I normally do when I'm moderating panels, with something I like to call rapid fire. So I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of quick questions, kind of get our feet wet. So Ricardo, I will start with you. We'll do Ricardo, Megan, and Larry in that order just for this first section here. What does ESG mean to you in one word?
I'll say 2 words: inspiring and concerning.
Megan.
Relevant.
Larry.
Everything.
All right, let's keep going. What stage do you think ESG is in? Do you think it's introductory, growth, maturity, decline?
I think it's discovery.
I think it's nearing the end of the introduction stage, kind of rapidly making its way into growth.
I agree with Megan. I think of it as something that's had about a 30-year runway. And if you look just ahead of us, it's going straight up.
Okay, great. And do you see ESG as an opportunity or a risk?
Definitely both.
Both, but we're focused on the risks.
Both.
Okay. And what is giving rise to the importance of ESG? I mentioned a couple of key stakeholders. What is it in your opinion?
I think it's largely not limited to public awareness, finally.
I think it's all of them, climate, regulators, investors, public perception. I think it's coming from all sides.
Yeah, I think it's a circle and everything feeds into it. It's public perception about what's happening in the world, the impact of that on regulators, the impact of that on companies, and it's just a continuous cycle.
Okay. Which ESG component do you think is most challenging or difficult to adopt? The E, the S, or the G?
If I had to choose one, I would go for social, just because it's more ambiguous and less defined right now.
I'd say environmental. I think that's at its earliest stage.
I would say environmental also, and I guess we'll talk about why in our more detailed segment.
All right. Well, on that note, Larry, let me just do one final one in this rapid fire section, and I'll make it a nice, easy one: a true or false. Are advancements in technology and technological platforms required to engage in ESG?
True.
False.
The tiebreaker, no.
No, okay. All right, well, we have a whole bunch of different narratives to unpack here, so we're going to jump right into the next section, introduction. Larry, this one's for you. How would you define ESG at this stage where we are right now?
And I'll sort of really build on what I think we all said in the rapid fire portion. It is really everything. there is almost no issue that is impacting corporate America or investors in America or the workforce in America or in the world that can't be recast either narrowly or broadly into an ESG prism. So it is everywhere you look, and it is important for companies to deal with it. We see everything from your Fortune 100 companies that on a daily basis are announcing ESG departments at the most senior level of the C-suites. And you have early stage companies that are competing with that, that may have somebody that's got a CFO or a COO hat that has that as part of their portfolio, but it is everywhere. And it is something that people, need to the extent they haven't, consider in their corporate life.
Very good. Ricardo, this one's for you. What does a typical ESG transformation journey look like, and how much progress have you seen across the industry?
Thanks for that. So not to go into a lot of details because it's a complex and large topic, but we have seen those that are successfully implementing their ESG transformation, starting with a very solid materiality assessment. It's a complex topic, and the importance of doing it right shouldn't be underemphasized. Within ESG, there are hundreds of topics, metrics, categories that could be influential in the journey of a firm. And not doing it correctly and asking internal stakeholders and external stakeholders what is important and what can drive the success of the business could be catastrophic for the subsequent stages. Not doing it right, that is. After that materiality assessment is completed, looking into how to embed those topics into strategy is critical as well. And that's even before starting to think about how to organize, how to put a governance structure in place to drive those topics in the organization. Then you can start thinking about what data, what metrics, how to embed those capabilities into your operations or your BAU processes, your risk management processes, and then starting to disclose and tell your story. Those are the subsequent stages. But if you don't get the materiality assessment right, to embed that into strategy and that inform the governance, then you can go into the wrong direction very, very quickly. And we have seen some firms that had to go back to ask the key questions at the beginning. At the end of the day, instead of getting lost within E, S, and G subtopics, we just ask our clients, how are you protecting the environment? How are you looking into how the environment will affect you? That's the E. How is your firm fostering stability? That's the social side. And how are you promoting equity? That's the governance side. And if you can really try narrow down the E, S, and G into those basic questions, that's a good way to start.
All right, great words of caution. Hey, Megan, can you share some examples of how E, S, and/or G have impacted banks?
Sure. So in my role as a ratings analyst, we are most focused on, where and when ESG issues can impact credit. And in many ways, when those issues have been material, they've long been factored into the ratings process because there's kind of a risk materiality analysis that goes into that process even before there was, an ESG umbrella. But I would say, for the majority of US banks, ESG is not a material credit rating driver, but we certainly have some really relevant examples of when those risks have materialized and had an impact. And just to give examples for, ES and G separately, on the environmental side, we rate banks that operate in Puerto Rico, and they faced asset quality deterioration from the physical risks and aftermath of hurricanes and the fallout on their island economy. And that led to some negative rating actions. On the social side, Wells Fargo currently has a negative outlook, stemming from the ongoing fallout from its deficient sales practices. We view that as an example of social risk because it's evident of the heightened scrutiny that banks face when they interact with their customers, and how such failures there can have pretty significant impact. Governance is an area where in the US, we have examples of US banks that have faced various regulatory written agreements for governance shortcomings, and that's had a negative impact on ratings. In recent past, Santander USA comes to mind. We also have examples of where superior governance has actually uplifted the rating because there's been a very strong track record in risk management. For example, US Bank comes to mind. So, we have examples in all three categories of when ESG can be material to credit and has impacted the credit ratings.
Great, that's great. Hey, Ricardo, I just want to swing back to you for one more second. So I recently saw that Barclays helped facilitate the first social bond deal of its type targeting COVID-19, demonstrating real action from investors with a focus on social responsibility towards making a difference for those that were impacted by the coronavirus. So my final question to you in this introduction section is, have you seen COVID-19 make an impact on the ESG movement?
Thanks for that question, Adam. So at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I actually thought that would accelerate the ESG journey. It's hard to kind of know that scientifically because we cannot go back in time and see how that agenda would have accelerated or moved otherwise. But I think that the COVID pandemic can be seen as a proxy of how society at large can or can't, depend on your point of view, get together to tackle common issues like climate change, social inequality, and so on. Financial services is unique because every element of E, S, and G, let's say pandemic, climate change, you name it, needs to be financed if it's going to be resolved. And the financial services industry is that conduit for that financing. Only for climate, for example, hundreds of trillions of dollars are calculated to be needed in order to finance the transition to a low greenhouse gas economy. So that's a good example of how the financial services industry needs to help. I just hope that we can all learn from the many errors in response to the pandemic to figure out how we can get together as society, as an industry, to resolve some of the key challenges behind E, S, and G. Climate change is a longer term one, so maybe it's not a good proxy towards when you compare it to COVID, but I think there are other shorter term elements that are in closer proximity. And I think working together, it's a key topic that we need to learn from, of the goods and the bads from the pandemic.
Very good. Okay, we're gonna shift over to the E now and spend about 10 minutes on the environment. This next question is for Megan and Ricardo, but Larry, don't you worry. I have about an 8-part question coming for you right after that, so stay tuned. Okay, Megan and Ricardo, maybe you guys can tackle this one together. Former President Obama said, "We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it." So regulators, including the New York Fed, find that climate change possesses a significant risk to the US financial institutions. So what are the largest threats and risks of climate change? And maybe Megan, you could take that. And how will that impact financial services in the future? Maybe Ricardo, you can cover that together. Megan, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think it's a great question. And just to really underscore that, I mean, I think the October FSOC report on climate-related financial risk, identified climate change as an emerging and increasing threat to US financial stability. So that really underscores, how climate change, the transmission risk from climate change into financial stability in the US. And that report, tasks the various regulatory agency members to consider changes to new regulation or guidance to address some of those issues, developing data, methodologies, disclosures related to climate change. So I think we're going to see more there. We would view all of that as positive because we think it's essential to develop standards and best practices for climate risk identification, disclosure, and ultimately managing those risks. But stepping back and talking about, where we see the key risks here. With respect to climate change, we see two major risks for banks. The physical risks from, the actual increasing in frequency and severity of climate events, and carbon transition risks, essentially the risk of stranded assets as the economy decarbonizes, and thinking about what's in banks, financed loan portfolios and investments. So, how do we address that? we do think it's challenging, but ultimately, stress testing and modeling these risks under different climate scenarios is one way just to kind of get our arms around the risk exposure. Certainly, we're seeing efforts in Europe to start that, and taking potential losses and looking at them against, capital and profitability is one way to look at, an individual risk's potential exposure there.
Great.
I have to say, Adam, I think Megan and I in the rapid fire questions did not necessarily provide the same answers all the time. Not that we disagreed, we just provided slightly different answers. That changes in this one. I think we fully agree on this particular question. Megan alluded to physical and transition risks. But Megan, you also mentioned that you're focusing on the risk side of ESG. I would just add to your question that we have seen our clients looking at that scenario analysis and materiality assessment to look into opportunities as well. In addition to the FSOC, a number of agencies, including the Fed, the OCC, NYDFS, CFTC, they all have come up with very similar kind of comments related to the implications of climate risk as a systemic threat to the US financial markets. The OCC in middle of December came up with initial guidance about creating a risk management framework for addressing those climate risks. I realize that is initially applicable only to the largest financial institutions, 100 billion plus, but I would see some of those principles as useful to organizations from all different sizes. And that guidance from the OCC is very similar, not identical, but similar to the one that the BCBS provided earlier last year. Similar guidance in terms of establishing a risk management framework across governance, risk management, scenario analysis, and so on and so forth. So regardless of the size of your organization, looking at that guidance is a good proxy of what's to come and trickle down eventually through the financial services industry in the US.
Very good. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Megan. Larry, we're going to get to a lot in the governance section, but on environment, here's a question, and I guess I'm going to tee up a whole bunch of balls and you could swing away at any of them that you'd like here. So sure. What are the E issues you in your practice representing SEC reporting public companies and private companies? What are they? I just jotted down a couple of them. I could be off here, but regulatory and market driven, climate risk disclosures, coming SEC rule changes, sustainability reporting, data verification, greenwashing litigation, market investor driven. I mean, there's no shortage of topics that are out there. But from your perspective,
there is no shortage. And as I, starting where I started, the pressures on this one are coming on companies from all fronts. Both SEC reporting companies are dealing with increased pressure and increased rules and coming rules from the SEC on climate disclosures. So they're all obviously regulatory driven from the bank regulators, and then there are market driven from who do customers want to deal with, and more importantly, who do vendors and suppliers want to deal with. One eye opener I saw this week, and I don't know if other folks saw it, was that Edelman, one of the largest advertising firms in the world, was doing a review of their own portfolio and determining who they wanted as their clients. And they were going to reach out to their clients that hadn't spoken out sufficiently as it related to the topic of emissions and carbon and climate change, and say, what are you going to do to address your deficiencies, or you are no longer going to be a client of Edelman. I mean, to me, that is a major step in a new direction, that people, obviously, you want to make sure your customers are satisfied and your regulators are satisfied and dealing with public pressures. But now that you also have to deal with pressures from people that are your service providers is quite interesting. Another topic that is gaining, in some ways, increased visibility is what I'll call the sustainability reporting. And again, if you look at your Fortune 500 companies, some of them have been doing this for upwards of 5 or 6 years, but it's trickling down to the NASDAQ mid cap, the rest of the New York Stock Exchange companies, and your larger private companies. What is a sustainability report? If you look at what a public company discloses in their 10K or in their proxy statement on E issues, it might take a page, it might take 2 pages, it might take 3 pages. But the sustainability report, if you go to ExxonMobil's website and you pull up their sustainability report, it might be 150 pages. It might transcend 3 or 4 different links on their webpage. And it's obviously easy to pick ExxonMobil as an example. But if you go to any Fortune 500 company, you are going to find somewhere on their investor page, somewhere on their About Us page, their sustainability report, which does a very deep dive into, as Ricardo mentioned, there might be 100 subtopics. These sustainability reports go into some length. And who is the audience? The audience is their investors. The audience is their customers. The audience is their regulators. The audience is public opinion, which sort of leads to the next point and one of the coming hot issues as it relates to the e-data that's both in public companies' SEC reports and in their sustainability reports and the reports they give to people like Megan who are rating them. And that is, how is this, and maybe this is a new, an up and coming line of business for Ricardo's company, but how is this e-data verified? There's very little in the e-world that's agreed upon in terms of, there are a handful of organizations out there that are putting out standards, but there's not a unified body like there is for accounting that says, when I look at a company's financial statements, I've got some comfort that Deloitte has audited them in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and I know what that means. So one of the hot topics is, how is this data verified? And it's got a number of implications for how does the world look at it? But it also, we talked about, is it an opportunity? Is it a risk? One of the obvious risks is something that sprung up over the last several years, and I'll call it a greenwashing litigation. And that is litigation that companies face for things they say about their environmental practices, or things that they don't say. And who are the sources of this litigation? It is, to some extent, it is your expected cast of characters. And I don't say that in a pejorative or a judgmental way. It is the SEC suing companies for false statements about E. That is sort of the low-hanging fruit. And because they say, relatively little about it, it's probably one of the lowest levels of risk. But it's FTC. So have you told consumers better things about your products than exist in reality? And there has been FTC false claims acts, cases brought against companies for things that they have said against E. And then there's your state regulators. The probably most one of the more famous ones is the New York State case against ExxonMobil. It was ultimately a loser under the Martin Act in New York, but claims that ExxonMobil misled investors by not talking about their impact on the environment for the last 20 years, if you will, similar to sort of the claims that the cigarette manufacturers had by individual plaintiffs for not letting people know about the risks of cigarettes. So we are just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of this greenwashing litigation and what companies and the risks that companies are going to face, along with the opportunities for the companies that get this right to look good in the eyes of their customers and their employees and their vendors and investors.
Yep. Great call, Larry. Thank you. Last question on the environment, Megan, if I could flip it back to you for a second. What does Moody's believe banks face regarding the risks from carbon transition? And does a bank's net zero commitment or green financing commitment mitigate such risks?
Yeah, so I mentioned that's one of the 2 major risks that we see banks facing from climate change. And I mentioned, carbon transition risk is really around stranded assets. The potential for declines in loan quality or asset prices as the economy decarbonizes. We do expect most banks can mitigate this risk through active portfolio management, given the longer time horizons for some of these risks to materialize and for ultimately carbon transition to occur, and the actual commitments to their borrowers. But on the green financing commitment, some banks have incorporated this into their strategy for mitigating climate change risks. But really at this point, these commitments are at a pretty early stage, and their capacity to actually mitigate the risks of carbon transition and other commitments in their loan portfolio is pretty untested. Again, because I mentioned the long time horizon over which climate risks develop, and ultimately the uncertainty of the path and effects of climate change. But as these risks become more apparent, data availability and climate risk modeling capabilities improve, and we see a better understanding of the risks and ultimately the path of decarbonization. We do expect at some point, bank strategies and actions here to become more differentiated and to potentially help mitigate some of that risk, but that's not where we are today.
Great. I'm sure that's coming. Let's leg into social. Spend about 10 minutes on that. And Megan, I'm going to give you the first one here, specifically addressing the S. What are the key social risks banks are facing?
Yeah, so this is a good question because, ESG is such a broad umbrella that people can look at from different lenses. And ultimately the lens that we're coming at it from, as I mentioned, is, where are there risks that are material to credit? And so we have an ESG classification system that we use across all industries and geographies where we have ratings that help in our assessment of ESG risks. And it helps to kind of break down those broad umbrellas of ES and G into the different components and issues that we see as most relevant to credit. So for social, this may be unfamiliar. Some of you may be thinking about social from a different lens, but ultimately when we're thinking about social risks, we're thinking about customer relations, human capital, demographic and societal trends, health and safety, and responsible production. And so then when we think about, how do those risks apply to banks, we view customer relations as the most relevant and presenting the most risk to banks, evidenced by the Wells Fargo example, and really just inherent in their business models as banks, the service that they provide and the interactions they have with customers. We do see some moderate risks from demographic and societal trends, and really how that's materializing in the U.S. is around customer preferences for, greater use of technology, changing the way that banking services are being delivered. That obviously presents risks to banks that have yet to keep up with some of that changes or failing to invest today to keep up with future changes there. Responsible production, when we think about that in terms of financial services, that's in our view largely an investment banking issue, where there's complex, opaque, structured financial products that are being crafted, designed, and distributed in investment banking worlds that they can have various reputational and litigation risk. But back to customer relations, where we do see the most risk for banks. Again, as I mentioned, that's inherent in their business models because banks handle extensive customer and proprietary data. They're custodians of their customers' wealth, and they facilitate important transactions across critical financial infrastructure. So those reasons make them really prime targets for privacy breaches and cyber attacks, and also puts them at the risk of mis-selling and other types of misconduct. So both of these hazards can result in regulatory penalties or litigation. And Wells Fargo, again, is a great example of how these types of misconduct can have real financial implications.
That's outstanding. That actually really helped me a lot because speaking to a lot of financial institutions, this one is a little bit harder for people to get their arms around in terms of developing the narrative and figuring out what they could do about it. On that note, Larry, and then maybe Ricardo, if you don't mind jumping in too, because this is a great launching pad from what Megan just said. Can you give us your thoughts? Larry, you want to go first on how you see social and what you see the risks are?
Yeah, sure. Well, in my public company practice, we see, again, the SEC has over the last 2 years, the rules have been evolving, in particular around human capital disclosure. Really, all of the topics that Megan mentioned are things that work their way in some way to public companies' disclosures, but human capital is probably the one over the last handful of years that has evolved the most in terms of companies being required to make disclosures around the nature of their workforce, how they're assisting their workforce, how they're treating their workforce, how they're paying their workforce. Of course, it's come sort of on the heels of, you know, the before that, the last major change in this topic was disclosures around pay ratio and telling people, how does your CEO's compensation compare to the salary of the average person in your workforce? You know, again, you know, some of these issues are important to investors. You know, I guess you could take a myopic view, as some people did, and say, you know, the SEC is shoehorning social justice into the 10K and into the proxy statement. And, you know, whether a customer would want to do business with somebody that overpays their CEO is not really an investor question, but in other ways, it is an investor question, because if customers aren't going to want to do business with people, then investors need to know that. So again, you've got this circle that's self-perpetuating. Do investors want to know? Do customers want to know? Investors want to know what customers care about, and of course, you know, companies can then make their decision in terms of where they want to be in the spectrum. And most of these, almost all the issues that I'm talking about, are disclosure issues, letting the world know. They're generally not substantive requirements to say you can't do this. You know, another example would be the supply chain disclosures that are, you know, now almost ubiquitous across public company websites, most companies' websites. What is the supply chain code of conduct? It's, you know, how are you doing business with the rest of the world? How are you engaging workforces of the world as your labor force moves into jurisdictions that may pay, you know, pennies per hour and may use child labor? You know, requirements that some of them aren't requirements and some of them are requirements. Companies are putting these policies on their websites. When you do commercial contracts, companies are requiring their counterparts. So if I'm sourcing parts from you and you're another US company, I may require you to acknowledge my policy, and that in doing your part of your work for my company, you are not going to use slave labor. You are going to not do business in places, at least as it relates to my contract, places that oppress their workers, that don't pay fair wages. And of course, if you are in California, this disclosure for some companies is not voluntary. California had, I guess, about 10 years ago, their what's called the California Transparency in Supply Chains, that require companies doing business in California that have over $100 million in worldwide gross receipts to put these policies on their websites. So again, it's just for companies that are headquartered in California, but that's a big chunk of the US economy. So you will see, and again, California in many ways, if you look back on an environmental topic that we already discussed, and the governance topic that we're going to discuss next, and on the S topic, California in some ways is a leading barometer for what is going to happen in the rest of the US.
Very good, very good. Ricardo, you want to take a swing?
Well, clearly the social aspect is taking a lot of our time because it is so complex, and in my initial word, it was somewhat ambiguous. So I think people are still grappling with the concept of what social actually includes. The good news is that banks and firms in general have some power to influence how they're perceived and kind of tell their story. If you look into the SASB standards, for example, they have commercial banking and business banking standards about how to report social metrics. And they go into things like security, privacy, access, selling practices, and then you could add a few others like human capital, for example. Choosing the right metrics is super important. And I think that's how firms will actually try to influence how they're being perceived outside. The challenge with choosing the metrics is, and my view is, that people will coalesce to those that are more quantitative in nature, because then the raters and rankers like Megan we'll be able to compare across the different firms. Challenge is that most of them are still not quantifiable yet, but I think those standards will continue to evolve. Right now, for example, if you look at some of those metrics within SASB, talk about financial losses from litigation coming from malpractices. And if you use that as a standard to report or be ranked, you're probably already influencing the ranking in a negative way. You don't want to be judged by the financial losses. You want to be judged by the good that you're doing on the social side. So things like, for example, having access to loans or access to credit in specific communities, low and medium income communities, for example. That's what you want to talk about, as opposed to be the victim of being ranked by things that maybe don't help in your narrative. So on the social side, choosing the right metrics, reporting on them early on, and linking them to the strategy is very important. And I think people will coalesce to those that are quantifiable in nature.
Very good. Hey, Megan, if you don't mind just closing out this section on social, let's just bookend it with your view of where you think this is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ricardo's comments, were excellent. We don't yet see a great way to measure, quantify, and really differentiate social risks between banks at this point. As I mentioned, a lot of these risks that we are calling out are really inherent in business models. And so we see like banks with like business models facing similar risks, but being able to differentiate how they're managing and mitigating that risks is an open challenge. And so, to the extent that we see, banks and other organizations able to coalesce around ways to measure and quantify that in metrics that actually have value add, that would go a long way towards differentiating. Because exactly to your point, Ricardo, where we stand today, thinking about the risks that banks face from customer relations, we're looking at the fines that banks have faced and paid for misconduct versus maybe some of the more opportunities that are provided in the social risk area as a way of measuring some of that. So totally agree with what Ricardo was saying.
You see, we agree in a lot of topics, Megan.
All right. It's good to have diverse opinions, right?
That's true.
All right. So we have 15 minutes left. We're going to leg into governance now, probably do 10 minutes on that, and then about 5 minutes and some closing comments and projections about the future. Now, I know, Larry, if to give you an open-ended question on governance and what you see the issues are, probably could take up that whole time, given your expertise in that area. But maybe you could just give us a minute or two, given that's what you largely do for a living. So give us your view of governance and where you think that's going.
Well, sure. Thank you. I think that the hottest topic in governance right now is probably diversity in the boardroom. NASDAQ, for companies that are listed on NASDAQ, recently adopted a rule in this area. It's got some California predecessors that I'll mention, but the NASDAQ rule with a phase-in period requires, and again, it's interesting. It's not a requirement to have diverse directors on the NASDAQ side, but like so many other rules that come out of the SEC or the stock exchanges, it is a requirement to either have diverse directors in the boardroom or disclose to the world why you don't. And again, so it remains to be seen. I think most public companies are looking to satisfy the requirement that they have a diverse boardroom because they see the benefits of that. But there is this door out of the room, if you will, like there are for so many other of the requirements that the SEC has and NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange have imposed on governance structures, and that is to say, okay, well, we don't meet this NASDAQ definition of diversity, but here's why we think our board is otherwise a good board, or here's what we're doing to take steps in that direction. The New York Stock Exchange has not proposed a rule like that. To my awareness, they're not thinking of one, but I wouldn't be surprised for the New York Stock Exchange to have a similar rule. Now, again, I mentioned, California is often the laboratory for all things ESG. And California, in fact, does have a requirement for public companies that are headquartered in California to have diversity in their boardroom. So that is an actual substantive requirement. California Attorney General has jurisdiction to bring in enforcement on that. And there are other G issues that are sort of maybe not your newfangled G issues, but G goes to, how is a company governed? Is it governed by the board for the benefit of the incumbent management, or is it governed for the benefit of some other view of what is best for the company? And these issues have existed in corporate law since the beginning. Of course, there's ways to say, well, what's good for what's doing good is good, and that's that's often the answer to the share. That's in some ways, again, a circular answer to the shareholder-centric version of, yes, well, by doing good, we're doing best for our shareholders, as opposed to saying we can ignore our shareholders in some ways, and do things that are good for other constituencies, even if those might not be best for our shareholders. Again, those things have been debated amongst the academia in the corporate world since there was the first corporation and the divorcing of ownership of the company from labor. But some of the other issues that are out there is the SEC just recently passed some rules that allow dissidents to run a hostile slate of directors within the company's own proxy statement, which is miles apart from the way it was traditionally done, which was if you were a dissident or an activist investor and you wanted to put your own board member on the board, you had to run your own proxy battle, which was very expensive. Now you have, if you comply with the company's rules for giving notice and having a qualified person, the company within their proxy statement, within their ballot box, will have to include your choice. So I think that's a new rule that just became effective. And so, TBD on how that plays out, but I do think we'll be seeing more activists take positions that result in a small slate of directors being run within the company's proxy statement.
Very good. Thank you, Larry. Hey, Megan, what are you seeing in terms of disclosures regarding ESG, and what data or disclosures do you use to assess ESG risk from a credit perspective at Moody's?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is that we don't, because at this point, we don't see enough consistency and value add in the existing data and disclosures that banks and really all companies are putting out at this point. They to date have not, in our view, proven to be useful in differentiation or analysis. Obviously, we review any and all disclosures where companies make them, in their sustainability reports, in climate change questionnaires, TCFD reports, their bespoke ESG reporting on their websites that was mentioned earlier. But at this point, we don't find enough value and consistency in the metrics that are being disclosed. So we expect over time, demand from regulators and investors will, drive better data, better disclosures, better metrics that actually prove useful in analysis and differentiating companies on these areas. So, we hope it'll evolve over time, but to date, our approach to assessing ESG risks remains a pretty qualitative one.
Okay, very good. Ricardo, how can banks integrate ESG, especially climate risks, into their credit decisions?
Thanks, Adam. So I think it's a nascent topic, and I think people are struggling not only with ESG, but actually starting with climate, which is maybe one of the most tangible ones. And what we have seen the most advanced clients doing is proactively looking at the business portfolio. What are the products and services that they will actually finance? Who are the clients they want to finance? That just kind of to start the process. Then embedding climate into internal risk ratings during the underwriting process. Make sure that you understand what are the physical and transition risks that your clients are subject to, so you can embed that into your credit assessment. And many firms, especially the largest ones, have started hiring transition risk specialists that can actually assess client by client how those transition risks may affect them. It's an maybe leading practice. We have seen a lot of that in Europe, and I think in the US will definitely accelerate. Then transferring those climate risks where possible, and that can be done via hedging or collateral management or any other mechanisms. And obviously reassessing the probability of default as part of the stress management process. Don't rely on the old metrics, but really stress them, making sure that climate is part of that stress test to assess the probability of default. And of course, anticipate and monitor any regulatory challenges that may affect how you do business in those particular industries that you decided to work with. Again, it's not just continuing to work with them, but going back to the first step, make sure you assess whether you want to be part of those industries and where you don't want to take those risks.
Hey, Ricardo, could you just follow-up question? Could you just unpack your comment on regulatory challenges? What are the regulatory trends that you see shaping management of climate risk change through the lens of governance?
I think it's understanding, making sure that you can evidence, you understand what are those physical and transition risks. If you go into the OCC guidance, for example, it suggests that leadership and the board, they should all be conversant and intelligent and understanding about what those climate risks are, both physical and transition risks. Not only being able to show that you have included them into your assessment, but you actually understand how those climate risks can change in time. So that may become a regulatory expectation. It's not just a best practice, but a regulatory expectation. Again, we'll start with the largest banks and will trickle down later on, but it's good to start looking into it as a good practice to have now, because it should become a prevailing or a common practice in the future. And that's just one example, Adam.
Okay, very good. All right, we have, it's hard to believe, but we only have 5 minutes left. We're having a great conversation here. And maybe it's a good time to start our conclusion, which is ending on the future of ESG and any recommendations that we might have. So, Megan, I'm going to go to you because you covered a little bit on the S side, but just in general, as we come to an end of our presentation, what do you expect from ESG and maybe more on E and G, since you covered a lot of the S? How do you see it evolving over the near term?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the governance side, just kind of kick that one out of the way. We think that we generally think that's a really well-developed risk area for banks that is pretty well understood. Certainly, there's going to be new trends in disclosure. I completely echo the point around our expectation for focus on board level diversity and disclosures there to be a trend in governance going forward. But maybe coming back to environment, spend a little bit more time there. Thinking about how, what's on the horizon there. We think there is going to be a lot of momentum around climate disclosures and environmental risk disclosures. We're seeing more banks publish TCFD reports, and we're seeing those TCFD reports be more fulsome in their content. And banks are starting to get a handle around, their own greenhouse gas emissions, but we think that's less relevant than the ultimate greenhouse gas emissions that they ultimately finance. So I think that's kind of the next evolution. Also, there seems to be some gaining momentum around net zero banking alliances, where the largest banks in the US have committed to net zero financed emissions by 2050. So looking to see how and if that trickles down to other US banks. We're seeing opportunities. I know we focus more on risks, but there certainly are opportunities here. Green lending and investments will bring major commercial opportunities for financial firms. And just a continued build out of the framework to assess climate related risks in the loan and investment portfolios in particular is kind of where we see environmental going over the next couple of years, but hopefully quarters.
Very good. Larry, any predictions as we come to a close?
Oh, I think more and more companies are going to have ESG issues sort of float up to the C-suite. Of course, our Fortune 500 companies, our largest companies are well ahead of this. But I think when you get down to your mid-tier and your next tier and your larger private companies that haven't been focused on this, I think my prediction is that they will begin to focus on this, and they're not going to be on the bleeding edge of it. But whether it's a regulatory driver, an investor driver, or a customer driver, or a combination of all three, we are going to see more and more companies pay attention to this topic, especially on the C, and especially in the financial sector, where I think a few years ago, if you were talking to people about what are our risks, it was largely focused on, to go back to where Megan started, it was largely focused on the physical, right? Are we financing a beachfront hotel in North Carolina that's going to be hit by a hurricane? And very quickly, that has emerged to where you wake up in the morning and you read the Wall Street Journal and you see, Senator Warren quoting a Sierra Club report that says, the 10 largest US banks are responsible for financing as much emissions as Russia produces. So you're comparing the financier, who is, 2 steps, 3 steps removed from the action, to the actual, production of the carbon emissions in Russia. So I think we're just to go back again to where we started. We are just at the beginning of this topic. We've got a moving target, but I think more and more companies are going to be focused on it.
Very good. Thanks, Larry. Ricardo, closing thoughts?
Just to focus on the adoption of standards, that's something that will continue to accelerate. Larry mentioned before the lack of standards in terms of understanding what is ESG and how they will be accounted and audited. COP26 in Glasgow last year mentioned the creation or the acceleration of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ASSB. So I think those standards will accelerate. We have somewhat developed in the E side, not as much on the S and the G side. I think that will change very, very soon. And you either follow and are a victim of it, or you try to influence and stay on top of it. So I think that's a big suggestion for our clients: you stay on top of that before it's too late.
Okay, and I just want to end with two closing comments. One, a question, Ricardo, while you're still up there. There's an expression, I want to end where I started. In my rapid fire, I asked a true/false question about, does it cost a lot of money to get this up and running? You folks were mixed. From my perspective, when I am out talking to all the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York's members about ESG and other things that are big investment, like fintech and things like that, they always point to the money. It's a big investment, but I can't just leave it. We can't just end our session here without going back to that. So, Ricardo, you said it does not require a large financial investment, I believe. You said false, and Megan said true, and Larry kind of split it in the middle. Very, very quickly, thoughts about why I think the membership listening is going to be excited with not a huge investment. So go ahead, kick it off.
I think right now it takes a lot of intellectual investment. So it's soft dollars that need to go into this topic. Eventually, it will get into data technology and so on. But right now is the intellectual aspect that needs to take precedence.
Okay, Megan?
Yeah, so I don't think it takes a huge advancement in technology, but it will certainly be a cost center to be able to build up the intellectual and tools and framework and really wrap your hands around this. It will take some investment to build up all of that.
Larry?
I don't think it is a big investment to engage. So for people that have done nothing, is it a big investment to say, I'm going to add diversity in my boardroom? I'm going to be aware of not just what I myself am doing, but what people are doing with my money. I don't think if you're going to be on the leading edge of this, on the bleeding edge of this, if you're going to be, addressing all the things we've talked about today, yes. But if it's something you haven't been focused on and you believe now is the time is right to engage in it, I think that is an easy thing to do.
Okay, very good. Well, certainly listening to the three of you speak, how passionate you are about the space, I think it's really important for people to get in the game and start, even if you're starting small, to just evolve over time, because it's certainly not going anywhere. Ricardo, Megan, Larry, I want to thank you all for being with me today. And New Jersey Bankers, we want to thank you for allowing us to spend some time in your agenda here to talk about a topic that we all believe very strongly about. Once again, our contact information is on the platform at the New Jersey Bankers app. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss it. We got through just about half of the questions we wanted to cover. There just never seems to be enough time. So everybody be well, take care, and thanks for tuning into our session.